What happens when two bass road warriors spend quality time talking music and life with one of their peers? Bassist, educator, author David C. Gross and bassist and head honcho of KnowYourBassPlayer.com, Tom Semioli, trade dates with the legends of rock, jazz, funk, blues, folk, country, and more. Notes from an Artist, revealing conversations with the legends who've created the soundtrack of our lives. What happens? You're about to find out. It's another episode of Notes from an Artist.
And David C. Gross, welcome to our listener for another thrilling episode of Notes from an Artist. I am Tom Semioli, co-host of Notes.
David Gross, but Tom, we really need to find out who our listener is and send him a T-shirt or something.
Yes.
Not a T-shirt of ours, just a T-shirt.
Well, actually, this show isn't, we just yell out the window and whoever's walking by is our listener. That's how we do this. But this is a fun episode. It is going to be a two-parter for our listener, and it is Alan Paul. He is a writer and musician and blogger, and he has just written his fourth book. It is entitled Brothers and Sisters, the Allman Brothers Band, and the Inside Story of the Album That Defined the 1970s. It is out now on St. Martin's Press. And of course, the album he is talking about is the Allman Brothers and Sisters album in 1973. Now, David, you and I come from two different generations of Allman Brothers fans. You are of the original Allman Brothers with Duane Allman and Dickie Betts, and I am of the latter day with Chuck Leavell and Lamar Williams, because that's the version of the Allman Brothers that was introduced to me by the Allman Brothers and Sisters in 1973. And then I went backwards and, of course, went off and found the first two records in Fillmore East and Eat a Peach. So
interesting to me, and I should have mentioned it during the show. I would have liked to have gotten Alan's take on it. But the irreplaceableness of Duane Allman created from a two-guitar to a guitar keyboard situation. And that in itself is a very big deal.
Yes. And of course, what propelled the Allman Brothers was, of course, Dickie Betts's hit Ramblin' Man, which is a rock standard now. And that was a huge tune in 1973. Incidentally, that was the very last track that Berry Oakley played on. The late, great Berry Oakley. And I think also, and we didn't mention this in the interview, is that the sequencing on the album was in order, in the order of they recorded them. That's the way it appears on side one and side two. But this book not only goes into some of your Allman Brothers history with Duane Allman, but also talks extensively about the Grateful Dead, the band, the early history of Southern rock, and even more fascinating to us, the Jimmy Carter presidential campaign, wherein the Allman Brothers essentially got Jimmy Carter elected to president.
Yeah, pretty much so. But, another thing that we didn't touch upon, because the interview, well, folks, the interview's in two parts. It was so dense with incredible information, and we want to make sure that you guys listen to a lot of great music. So we've cut it in half. So you're going to listen to the first part tonight, and next Monday night, you'll listen to part two. But one of the things that I forgot to mention was Derek and the Dominoes.
Right. We didn't even get to that. Well, I mean, essentially that is out of the scope of this book. I mean, he did write another book on the Allman Brothers, One Way Out, Inside History of the Allman Brothers, where I would imagine, and I haven't read the book, that he delves into Derek, but certainly the legend of Derek and the Dominoes and Duane Allman certainly hung over Brothers and Sisters.
Yes, indeed so.
So they did have to, I mean, I understand the pivot. I didn't realize, again, that Les Dudek played on Brothers and Sisters. He was the dueling guitar with Dickie Betts on Ramblin' Man. And there was a time when Les was actually considered for the band, but they didn't want to try to replace Duane Allman aesthetically as well as musically. So Chuck Leavell got the call. And that was Chuck Leavell's introduction into, the major world of recording and performing artists. And of course, Chuck Leavell now, he's been the musical director of the Rolling Stones for something like 35 years now.
Yeah. He was 20 at the time he joined the band.
Right. And for you Allman Brothers fans and jazz fusion fans, and we didn't talk about this either, and it's also mentioned in the book, is the great Sea Level, yes, which was Jimo and Lamar Williams and Chuck Leavell from that version of the Allman Brothers Band. So lots of great stuff here. Let's start off with part one of Alan Paul, and you may be listening to this live on Cygnus Radio, or you may be listening to this on our Notes from an Artist podcast which is available on Apple, Amazon, Buzzsprout, and Spotify, and wherever podcasts are potted, David. So start our conversation with Alan Paul. Let us introduce our audience member to Alan Paul. And Alan, correct me if I've got this wrong. He is a writer. He is a musician, just like us, David. He is a blogger. He has quite a resume. New York Times bestseller list for Texas Flood, the inside story of Stevie Ray Vaughan. He's also written One Way Out, Inside History of the Allman Brothers Band. He's also written a fabulous book, Big in China, My Unlikely Adventures in Raising a Family Playing the Blues and Becoming a Star in Beijing. Did you know that Alan is a rock star in Beijing, Dave?
I had no idea. It's good to know. Next time I go to Beijing, I will say, hey, I know Alan Paul.
You know.
It couldn't hurt. It's been a few years, though.
It's been a few years. You were in the blues band Woody Allen, and that's Woody, W-O-O-D-I-E, David. And you were Band of the Year in Beijing in 2008.
That is correct.
So you got a taste of the rock star life, albeit in China, but I guess it's pretty good. Got to be rock star life in the United States, perhaps.
It's a lot different than being big in Japan, you know. A lot more people.
A lot more people. And, of course, the new book we're going to talk about is Brothers and Sisters, the Allman Brothers Band, and the inside story of the album that defined the 1970s on St. Martin's Press. David, if you forgot what an album is, this is what they look like. Okay, there's my favorite Allman Brothers live album. And I know, David, you prefer this version of the Allman Brothers. But
True.
This is a fabulous book, Alan, in that it's many books within the book. I mean, not only do we get the Allman Brothers history, talk very much about the Grateful Dead and their relationship with the Allman Brothers. We certainly do get a great overview of the early history of Southern rock, which, you know, the Allman Brothers were a big part of. Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign with Phil Walden, fascinating stuff. And also you talk about two important records and two records, I think, when you look at major bands and their members step out as solo artists, I certainly think Greg's Laid Back and Dickie's High White Call are among the best. They're great records. But you say in the book that this was the most difficult and most fun of all the books you've written. How so?
Well, first of all, thank you for all that. It was the most difficult because of everything you just mentioned. There were so many different elements involved. So just for instance, writing about Jimmy Carter and the Allman Brothers' involvement in the Carter campaign, I try not to do anything halfway. So I couldn't understand their involvement if I didn't really understand his campaign. So I went really, really deep. So I did research on every topic that you discussed that went far deeper than what's actually reflected in the book. We do feel strongly that for a book to be as good as I wanted it to be, which is great. I mean, that's what I was really trying for. You can't just write the things you know. You have to know way more and then be able to summarize it. So I went really, really deep on Jimmy Carter campaign. I went really, really deep on Grateful Dead. I went really, really deep on the history of Southern rock. So that's why it was hard. It was just, and if I'm writing about a presidential campaign, for instance, I wanted to be extra careful to be right, to be really accurate. And then you have the drug trial that basically ended this version of the Allman Brothers in 1970. Yes. I basically summed that up in a chapter, but in order to do that, I had to really, really understand it. So I read the court cases, went really deep into the Macon News and Telegraph archives and read thousands and thousands of words on the trial that as it was covered in the newspaper at the time. So all of that was hard. And that's why I say it was the most hard. It was the least linear. I mean, certainly with Stevie Ray Vaughan in Texas Flood and the whole Allman Brothers history and One Way Out, I did similar things, but I just, because I wasn't going as deep into anything, since this limits the time frame, I didn't feel like my research was quite as intensive. It was more based on my own interviews. But it was fun because I really enjoyed all of that. I mean, I'm a political junkie, so delving, spending a lot of time really reading up on Jimmy Carter in the 1976 campaign was fun for me, but then it was also hard to then summarize it. So it was both really, really challenging and really fun. I mean, I love the Grateful Dead, so it was fun for me to spend a lot of time digging deep into it. It was a lot of work to then figure out, really understand their history and summarize it in what's essentially, 10 pages or something. That's a lot.
There's that wonderful quote, to write a book, you have to be the book. And I sure as heck wish I knew who wrote it.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
it certainly stuck with me. And
yeah, thank you. I have not actually hadn't heard that before, but I like that. That is how I feel. That's how I approach it, and that's how I've approached all of them. So they're all challenging. They all have their own challenges, but this just had the extra challenge of, to be this book, I did have to go down so many different rabbit holes and invest myself fully. And sometimes I could spend days chasing down something that's basically going to be one sentence in the book. But it's fun for me. I mean, I enjoy that. I like the reporting. I like talking to people. I like an archival research. So
again, you also had the advantage of Kirk West, who had an exhaustive library of tape interviews with the Allman Brothers. So that must have been a treasure trove for you.
Totally incredible. So yeah, just to explain a little bit who Kirk is and what those tapes are. Kirk is first of all, he's one of my best friends. And so that's sort of the basis for all of this. We've got a 30+ year relationship that began as sort of just a very much a professional relationship. Kirk was the keeper of the flame for the Allman Brothers. When I met him in like 1989, 90, when the band reformed in 1989, he got hired as, initially was a tour photographer. Kirk really is a photographer by trade. I mean, that's what he did for years, and he's got wonderful photos. Anyone can go to kirkwestphotography.com and see. It's not like he's not just a guy who took pictures around the Allman Brothers. He's an incredible photographer with great photos of the Rolling Stones, Police, and every Chicago blues artist you've ever heard of, and many you haven't. But he was, he was the tour mystic for the Allman Brothers. So he was the guy that helped me. My relationship with him is what transitioned me from being a regular journalist, writing about it primarily for Guitar World magazine at first, where I was the managing editor, into becoming sort of an insider, because I became friends with Kirk. Through him, I got to know all the crew members. And so when I would go interview Dickie and Greg and these guys, they kind of knew me as the guy, there's Kirk's buddy who's always around. It really changed the tenor of my relationship with him from being a normal journalist relationship to something a little deeper. And Kirk, before any of that, when the Allman Brothers were broken up in the mid-'80s, was doing a book, and he went around, interviewed everyone in the band and wives and managers and crew members and all that. Everyone you could think of, Bill Graham and other promoters. And then that was in 86 and 87 primarily. Then he got hired when the band reformed, and so he never wrote the book. And we had talked about this over the years, but as soon as I started writing this book, he said to me, "Would you like my tapes?" And that was just incredible. So of course I said yes. I went down to Macon, where he lived, in September 2021. And I came back with a double-sided suitcase. I was like carrying it like the Holy Grail, wrapped to my body, basically. I had brought a little carry-on down there, checked that to come back, because I had to carry these tapes with me. I mean, I practically felt like buying them their own seat and buckling them into the seat next to me, because I was nervous just putting them up above me. And they were incredible. That was also, talk about a lot of work and a lot of fun, that these tapes qualify as well. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of hours of interviews. So getting them digitized and then listening to them, making notes, figuring out how to use them in the best way was a lot of work, but incredibly gratifying and interesting. And I will say that if anyone is interested in audiobooks, if you listen to the audiobook, we have about 40 interview clips, mostly from these tapes, a few from my own interviews over the years on the audiobook. I think it's really unique. And in fact, let's connect after. I can get you guys some clips from that if you'd like it to.
I was just going to ask you to send us some.
Yeah, we'll play it on the show.
I'll connect you guys with Macmillan Audio. I don't know exactly how to do that, but it definitely can be done. And it's great. It's really cool. So yeah, these tapes were incredible. I already was started on the book when Kirk offered them to me, so I would have done this no matter what, but they became so central to the final book that it's hard for me to imagine exactly what the book would have been, although it would have existed, because there were certain areas that Kirk went into with them, that especially with Greg. Let me just start with Greg. So Greg, I interviewed Greg many, many times. I had a good relationship with him. I did some incredible interviews with him about music. I really got him to open up about Laid Back at various times, about songwriting, about his love for Tim Buckley and Neil Young and Jackson Brown, which people don't necessarily associate Greg with, but how they impacted them. I did so many great interviews with Greg, but there are some areas that I really never discussed with him because it was made clear to me to avoid. And the biggest one of that would be his relationship with Cher. That became a bit of a distraction in Allman Brothers land. People resented that the band was so associated with this one few-year period where Greg and Cher were such a big celebrity couple. But that was really a big part of this book. I mean, it had to be, even though it's not that many pages of the book, in this era, and it had a big impact on Greg, obviously, and on the Allman Brothers Band, ultimately. And in these interviews with Kirk, Greg spoke extensively, and I felt very, very honestly and openly about his relationship with Cher, beginning, middle, and end, good, bad, and ugly. And that alone was incredibly valuable. That's just one example. It's certainly not the only thing in Kirk's tapes by any means, but it stands out as something where I had this incredible first-person description from Greg about things that were really, really hard otherwise to talk to him about. But more broadly, as a biographer, for someone to pop up with unheard interviews, and most of these interviews had been unheard even by Kirk. There's some exceptions where he went back, but really most of them he did. He put in this case and filed it away. I mean, I was calling Kirk constantly as I listened to the tape, and reading him things or playing him little snippets, and he was blown away by what was on the tape. So it was an honor to be able to listen to them, and I had the perspective. I always have the perspective that whatever I'm doing is in the service of my readers, and I was certainly in that case. I mean, I was really hyper aware. I have these tapes because Kirk trusted me to do something great with them and to turn them into something. And so I was listening for everyone, and I'm really excited that we could get some of those clips on the audiobook. And Kirk and I are working on some ways to make them more widely available. So hopefully in the next year, people will be able to listen to the interviews in whole. We're just trying to figure out, we have some ideas, but we're trying to figure out the best way to make that happen.
Oh, wow. That would be great.
Fascinating.
So let me tell you a couple of things. First of all, I really enjoyed reading the book. It's very easy to read. Don't want to put it down because it's a great narrative. You write in such a way that you want to continue. But I've got a few things. First of all, I'm of the generation, I bought the first three Allman Brothers recordings. I am not a big fan of Southern rock. However, after reading this book, I'm going to do a little investigation. I also have a few real interesting, 6 degrees of separation. My sister was good friends with Eddie Harding. Okay. So when Time Seller / Don't Want You No More came out as a 45, I had a promo copy. So when I first heard the first Allman Brothers record, and I'm, wait a second, how does Spencer Davis and the Allman Brothers get together? That's a very bizarre combination. Second of all, Dave Laurie was my road manager in 89 and 90. Dave was working with the Allmans, about 91, 92?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was working with him by the end of 90, actually. So you really overlapped there. He became Greg's manager. I kind of forget which came first, if he was working directly for the Allman Brothers and then worked for Greg. I met Dave the first time I ever interviewed Greg in person, which was in 1990. I mean, I could look up the exact date. That was
right after we did the Robin Beck tour.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so it was right at the Tampa Convention Center, and Greg stood me up all day. We were supposed to do an interview in person, and I don't know how somehow Dave got a hold of me. I must have left a home number, because anyhow, he said, "Greg, so sorry, come to the show and come find me on stage right at the end of the show, and I'll bring you back to meet Greg." And so we did that. Yeah, so Dave Laurie is a great guy.
Yeah, very invaluable on this tour. I don't know if he told you much about that tour, but yes, he was invaluable. And the third thing that's really strange is when Marty LeBeau came out with her first record, her bass player was off doing something. So I was called in to sub, and we ended up opening for Greg in the Midwest a few dates, which was kind of interesting.
Well, that is fun. And yeah, I mean, listen, first of all, it's just fun to talk to people now that the book's been out a little bit and people who've read it, because all of my initial interviews for the book, of course, were people who had barely read it or just were powering through it. So it's nice to get more extensive feedback. To go to the Spencer Davis Don't Want You No More, that's an interesting story. I mean, basically, Barry Oakley and Dickie Betts played that version, more or less what you hear, the Allman Brothers instrumental version, in their band, The Second Coming. And so when they first got together, when Duane put this band together and they were jamming, I mean, Barry and Dickie had a repertoire that they'd been playing in The Second Coming. So that was sort of some of the stuff they were first jamming on. And when Greg came in with Don't Want You, I'm sorry, with Ate My Cross to Bear, which was really, he had written in California right before he left Los Angeles and came. There's a demo that was on the One More Try collection, which I did with Kirk. I wrote the liner notes and was really involved with Kirk. Fantastic collection that got delayed forever, finally came out in 95 and was immediately pulled because Greg had sobered up and decided he didn't like it, long story short, which was really disappointing. But demo version of Cross the Bear is really cool. It was recorded on Greg playing, I think it was a Fender Rhodes, an electric keyboard, and it was just like done in the living room of John McEwen, who recorded it from the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. Somebody figured out that Cross the Bear would make a perfect introduction. I'm sorry, I don't want you no more would make a perfect introduction into Cross the Bear. I have asked all of them. Nobody ever took credit for it. I think it just happened. Like they were playing both the songs, and probably somebody just realized it and did it. And so that, of course, became one of the definitive Allman Brothers openers because it was the opening 2 tracks of their debut album. And many, they only played it, I believe, over the years together and as an opener.
Oh, and you know what's also funny about it? It just shows you that 60s mentality that even though Time Seller was technically the A side, but back then you turn 45 or hey, what's on the flip side? And boom, it's actually a better tune. And unfortunately, since Stevie Wonder had just left the band, Stevie Winwood, it kind of was there.
Right.
Going downhill,
Yeah, well, you're one of the few people who who heard that and thought of that song, thought of the original first. Because most people got to know the song, I think, through the Allman Brothers and then went back.
That's because I'm old.
The advantages. But one of the fascinating stories in the book, and again, the book within the book, is Phil Walden's relationship with Jimmy Carter. Now, remember, I'm a few years younger than David, so I'm on the receiving end of all this stuff. And it was pretty fascinating to understand and just to look back about how these presidential candidates were now wooing the youth culture, because 18-year-olds get the right to vote in 71 it is. Mr. Thompson is writing glowingly of Jimmy Carter, and I'm a teenager. I read Rolling Stone, and I see, wow, Jimmy Carter's cool. He's quoting Bob Dylan. He's hanging out with the Allman Brothers. Now you have Jerry Brown with Linda Ronstadt and the Eagles. And of course, Gerald Ford gets on the bandwagon, and he has George Harrison to the White House around that time. Of course, you Beatles don't get you reelected, apparently. But it was very interesting on that take about how these presidential candidates were now wooing the youth culture. And again, Carter and Walden went very deep.
Yeah, so Jimmy Carter was the first one to really do this. And it really was, as you indicated, because of Phil Walden. So Phil Walden was the manager of the Allman Brothers and the owner of Capricorn Records, and a fascinating character, full of contradictions. I think most people hear that and understand what a conflict of interest that is. I go into it in depth in the book, but Phil ran their booking company, he ran the publishing company, he ran the record company, and he was their manager. He also had his fingers in, he was their traveler. He owned the travel agency. He had a piece of merch company. So basically, every place that there was a revenue stream, Phil either owned or was part owner of, and he was the manager negotiating with each of those entities. So it's just a massive, massive conflict of interest. So that's some of the downside of Phil. The upside of Phil is that he was this charismatic guy. He was brilliant in his own way. He was the one who kept the Allman Brothers on the road. He spent $150,000 to $200,000 into going in debt to that much for the first few years before the success of At Fillmore East. So he was a crucial figure. He also had this close relationship with Jimmy Carter when he was the governor of Georgia. And so when Jimmy was going to run for president, he met with Phil. They were, he asked for support. But I think he was thinking more traditional support, give me some money, give me some visibility. But Phil immediately saw the possibility of what he could do here. And he was on his election committee, on this campaign committee, and he put together these bands. It wasn't just the Allman Brothers Band. The Allman Brothers were the biggest fish. Marshall Tucker Band did things. Right. Phil was really in charge of it. He got a friend of his named Tom Beard, who I spoke to in the book, who was a banker in Hilton Head, South Carolina, but it was originally from Georgia, to come back and run it. And they had shows all over the place. So it was not just the Allman Brothers. And it's important to note that Jimmy Carter, as much as he was taking advantage of this situation, also really loved the music. I mean, Jimmy Carter was a real music lover. He loves these guys and this stuff. And the Allman Brothers really liked Jimmy Carter's politics. So, I mean, convenient relationship on both sides. It was also a real relationship. I mean, they really liked each other. Bill Walden and Alex Cooley, who was a great Atlanta promoter, who was also very involved in the Carter campaign and helped put on a lot of these events. One of the reasons they were so attracted to him was his racial politics. They were really sick as Southern men of being so associated with these vicious racists. Lester Maddox, who preceded Jimmy Carter as governor, was one of these arch segregationists. He owned a restaurant. He refused to integrate it. I mean, he closed it rather than allow black people to come eat in his restaurant. And when they tried to have a sit-in at his restaurant, he beat the kids with an axe handle. And there was a picture of that was all over the country, Associated Press. And so Georgia became really known for him and for that image. And they hated that. And that's a big part of why they backed Jimmy Carter. It's a big part of why the Allman Brothers backed Jimmy Carter. And you mentioned Jerry Brown. He was the other guy who, as you said, he was dating Linda Ronstadt off and on. He was really tight with David Geffen and other people in the Los Angeles music world. So he had the Eagles and Linda Ronstadt and Jackson Brown and that whole crew. But he got him into the race way, way later than Jimmy Carter. I mean, too late to really make an impact. Jimmy Carter had the advantage of no longer being the governor. Georgia at the time had a one-term limit, so he had finished in 1974. Jerry Brown was the governor of California, and I think he had only been elected in 1972. He might have even only taken office in 1974. Anyhow, he was new at the job, so it's kind of hard to be the governor of California and be running a national campaign. And so he got in really late. Now, in previous years, up until 1972, a lot of guys didn't really even run in primaries. I mean, the conventions really were like the party leaders would pick the candidate. But that was no longer the case, but partly because of the chaos that had happened in Chicago, partly because of, some Watergate reforms. And so there was a real primary, the way we think of it now, where the voters are electing the candidate. And Jimmy Carter just had too big of a lead for Jerry Brown to touch by the time he got in so late. Two of them together really did change the whole concept of that it was okay to consort with such people and have the support of rock and roll.
Well, it's right. And again, you always see in history, entertainment and politics, right? Politics is show business for ugly people. Back in the Kennedys, right? When they had the Rat Pack, Kennedy and the Rat Pack. And of course,
and then Sammy Davis with Nixon.
Sammy Davis, right, campaigning for Nixon. And you have to think at some point also, rock and roll was not an accepted part of the entertainment world yet. It was happening around the time of Brothers and Sisters. And to be courted by the governor, who was part of the establishment, these guys were, scruffy hippies in the eyes of the establishment. And now Jimmy Carter was quoting their lyrics. So that had to sweep Greg and the other guys off their feet a little bit.
It really did. And another example of that, you mentioned briefly before Dickie Betts' Highway Call album. Yes. While he was recording that at Capricorn Studios in Macon, Jimmy Carter came down for a visit with his wife, Rosalind. And the word got around that was going to happen. And they were all sort of excited. He was still the governor, I believe. And they were expecting sort of a photo op, and he'd come by and shake hands and take some photos. But he spent like hours there. He sat down in the studio. There's pictures. I have one in the book of him sitting at the control booth with Johnny Sandlin, the producer, with headphones on. I mean, he really liked it. He loved the music. And there's a quote in the book from Peter Conlon, who was the head of Atlanta Live Nation now, but was really involved in the Carter campaign on the music front. And he says, Jimmy Carter was not an opportunist, but he saw an opportunity. And yes. I think that sums it up pretty well.
Yeah.
That really
well, if you think about it, too, everyone from that generation. I mean, how many times do you go to a doctor now? Oh, you're a musician. Yeah, I play guitar or drums or what have you. So it was much more part and parcel of the entire fabric of society.
That's true, but not so much for politicians. I mean, they were really avoiding, listen, Greg was the most famous drug addict in America. I mean, he was on the cover of People magazine with Cher. There's a cover line that said something like, "She keeps him off of heroin and his band is hot again." That's not the kind of guy that politicians, generally flock to. But Carter stuck with him even in 1976 when there was the trial that we mentioned that ended up ending the Allman Brothers Band. Greg became the most radioactive guy in rock for a while there. I mean, his own band members abandoned him, basically. Rolling Stone suggested he might never be able to play again because he was such an outcast in rock. And the one guy who didn't abandon him was the guy who had the most cause to, which was Jimmy Carter, because this was just a few months before the election. And I think almost any politician of either party that we could think of in our lifetimes would have said something like, you could just imagine that the statement, I'm disappointed in my friend Greg. Well, I appreciate all the support he's given me. I can no longer be associated with him. Something like that. He did the opposite. I mean, he went to the Capricorn annual picnic in Macon in the middle of all this. And he addressed the press directly, and he said something to the effect of, if you don't want a president who associates with people like the Allman Brothers Band, you should just simply vote for another man. And I think that's pretty cool. And I think that whatever one thinks of Jimmy Carter and his politics, you should be able to appreciate and admire his loyalty and the fact that he stuck with them to the end. And obviously it didn't end up hurting him, but many people thought it would.
Yes.
Well, Alan, that brings up a really interesting point. In today's society, that would not fly. But with all the conspiracy theories and everything else that's running around now, would you think that a handler said, you know something, there's still all these 18-year-olds voting. You might not want to lose it because you might lose that. I mean, if you think about it, what's the point of, let's face facts. What was one of the reasons all the migrants are here, right? They can vote. So the reality of the situation do you think there was a handler that essentially said, hey, stick with this, you'll win?
No, I really don't. I've never heard. I talked to a lot of people in the campaign, and I've never heard any indication of that. I also don't think there was anyone pressuring him to drop them. I think he was very much his own man. And did what he believed. There was very little left for him to gain by the time he went down to that Capricorn picnic in '76. I mean, he had the nomination. He had the support of these people. They really weren't going to turn back to Ford, who was very tarred by Nixon, of course. And yeah, I think there was more for him to lose than gain. And I don't think it was about that for him. I think that he just believed in these guys. He appreciated their support, and he was sticking with them till the end.
That's good to know. It is.
That's my impression. That's very much my impression. And I spoke to a lot of people.
Another great element of the book for me is Dickie Betts finally gets his due, because he is forever in the shadow of Duane Allman. Now, again, the Allman Brothers that I came to know and love were the brothers and sisters Allman Brothers. So I'd heard from my older brothers, like David, about how great Duane Allman was. But Dickie Betts, what a great player he was. And you as a guitar player should certainly appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, they are really different players and different people, more to the point, or really different personalities. Duane was fiery, driven, amazing looking, with his orange hair and his hand on. And because of all those things, I mean, the spotlight was on him. He was a magnetic personality that you couldn't take your eyes off, and he played in a magnetic way that you couldn't take your ears off of, so to speak. But Dickie, who had the personality that he liked to sometimes just slide back into the shadows. So part of what happened in this brothers and sisters era was he had to deal with, you can't do that anymore. You're now the only guy standing front and center. Greg has a 400-pound piece of wood in front of him most of the time with the 3 organ, although in this era, he did come out and play guitar a few songs every night. But for the most part, he's back there. And Chuck Lavelle added to the band as a very worthy instrumental foil to Dickie, give him something to play with and off, and obviously another great solo voice. But he's also on a keyboard behind. So physically, Dickie was alone in the front of the stage, and he had to step up. He did sometimes have the tendency to shrink away, and it would cause problems because he couldn't do that anymore. And it was a personality thing. I'm not diagnosing him as being bipolar. I just want to be really clear about that, because I'm not in a position to do that. But this type of behavior was bipolar in a colloquial sense of like up and down. Like sometimes he would be up in front and pushing it and leading it. And sometimes he just wanted to shrink away in the shadow and not be in the spotlight. And during the Duane years, he could do that. And during the post-Duane years, he couldn't. And when he went into one of those moods, it made it really, really difficult and created all kinds of tensions and problems. But that that wasn't most of the nights. Those were unusual nights, although not infrequent, but not rare, I guess you would say. But most of the time he was up front and he was just killing it. Dickie has a very, very distinct sense of melody. Dickie has a very distinct sense of licks. The style he plays, anybody who's a guitarist will recognize it right away. But if you're not, there are certain types of sounds that we associate with the Allman Brothers that are so much out of Dickie's brain from the beginning. You know, his sense of melody, his way he structured licks and put them together was a key part of what the band did. He was the one who usually came up with the melody and the licks. Duane, who had more or less perfect pitch, I believe he had perfect pitch, but that's a specific term, means something. I can't say for sure he had it, but Duane had an incredible ear. And so even like the harmonies they would play, Dickie would usually come up with the lick and Duane would just immediately be able to grab onto it and play a harmony on the fly. So it was that combination was incredible, but it was Dickie who was usually coming up with the lick. He was the guy. He was a songwriter. You know, Robbie Robertson of the band, who just passed away, I think this applies to him. Guitarists who are great songwriters and have a compositional sense, I believe that carries over into the way they structure their solos as well. They play licks, even fills, with a compositional sense. They're not just note, they're architecturally sound. Again, I know that musicians will know exactly what I'm talking about, but I think that anyone who just listens to the music, it makes sense that way. And Dickie certainly had that from the start. So first vocal with the band was Blue Sky on Eat a Peach, which was their third album. But he already, he wrote Revival, Greg sang on Idlewild South. He wrote, of course, In Memory of Elizabeth Reed, the great instrumental. If you listen to those songs, even before he was doing vocals, and then you listen to Blue Sky, if you take those three songs and listen to the guitar playing and the structure of the songs, you'll have an understanding of what came out of Dickie's brain. And you can then apply it across, many other Allman Brothers songs, including things that Greg wrote. Just that essential to them, not only as a soloist, but as a composer.
And David, thus concludes part one of our interview with Alan Paul. But hey, listener, don't go away. We have a fabulous playlist to start. And what do we have, David? Some tracks from the Allman Brothers Band, tracks from the Allman Droys, which was Duane.
Tracks from Spencer Davis.
Spencer Davis and Second Coming, which featured Barry Oakley. So stay tuned for our playlist and part two next week.
That's right. So have a great week, folks, and we'll see you then.